Дорогие коллеги, добрый вечер. Мы продолжаем нашу серию семинаров. И сегодняшним семинаром мы открываем серию семинаров нового наступившего учебного года. Сегодня у нас доклад коллеги из Великобритании и профессора, например, Московского государственного лингвистического университета Стивена Пакса Леонарда. Стивен сочетает в себе лингвиста и антрополога, проводил полевые исследования в различных регионах мира, и на севере, и в Латинской Америке. И сегодняшний его доклад, который он любезно представляет на нашем семинаре, называется Doing Things with Voices, Colombian Kidnap Radio and the Sound of God. Доклад, как вы поняли, будет на английском языке, но я, скажем так, открою секрет Полишинеля, что Стивен на самом деле очень хорошо говорит, тем более понимает по-русски. Поэтому я думаю, что если кто-то в дискуссии, скажем, почувствует, что ему, скажем, проще задать вопрос на русском языке, я думаю, что проблем не возникнет.
Я питаюсь.
Да, я передаю слово Стивену, пожалуйста.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, as Dimitri said, so today's paper is going to be in English, but да, если будет непонимание, я питаюсь объяснять все на русском, а потом да. Okay, so I decided I would give today's paper in the style of a senior research seminar paper at a university in my country, in the United Kingdom, at an anthropology department. So it occurs to me that the style of the paper might seem a little strange or unusual to you. But anyway, stick with it. I hope you find it interesting. At night, I would listen to the radio. The sounds, they echoed in my mind. It was as if they had a life, like a body. I felt touched by this voice. You know, literally touched. For me, the radio voice was like something from the heavens. He looks up to the sky. I was deep in the jungle. I would hear suddenly the voice of my wife on a radio message. I had not seen her for 11 years. His eyes well up. Later at night, trying to sleep after the thrill of a radio message, on a few occasions I heard somebody talking to me. He looks up again at the sky. I could never remember the words. The voice was mesmerizing. It was a therapy, gentle, penetrating, soothing voice. It was unforgettable. I remember my heart thumping. It was the voice of God. I was sure of that. I never heard it after my release. I never heard it when my radio was taken away or when the radio batteries were dead. So this is an excerpt from an interview with Fernando. Fernando is not his real name. All the names are given codes in this paper. He was held hostage in the Amazon rainforest by the FARC, which is a left-wing terrorist organization, for 11 years. After 45 days of captivity, he was given a radio. I'm sitting in the home of Fernando. He's a former Colombian army general. Fernando lives in a highly secure compound on the outskirts of Bogota. It has taken a month to organize the meeting, and I had to pass through 3 sets of security before I could meet with him. Fernando was held hostage by the FARC for 11 years. This is a left-wing guerrilla group that has been in conflict for more than 5 decades with the Colombian armed forces and various paramilitary organizations. He suffered a dozen bouts of malaria, leptospirosis, and today walks with a limp, a result of the permanent injuries he suffered at the hands of his captors. Fernando was held initially with other high-profile prisoners and then subsequently in isolation. When the Colombian army approached his hiding place, he was marched through the rainforest to another camp. The marches were brutal, lasting for days and nights at a time, and sometimes under aerial bombardment, without rest or food and water. Every Saturday night, he listened to radio messages from his wife on a specially dedicated program called Voces de Secuestro, Voices of the Kidnapping, which broadcasts radio messages from family and friends of captives. These messages and his Christian faith kept him sane and prevented him from taking his own life. Some hostages spoke of how they believed a certain radio voice could result in an action. Such comments on how they were transformed by a radio voice gave me ground to think of the effect as performative. John Austen, in his 1962 classic, introduced the idea of performatives, which are actions produced through words or the process by which semiotic expression results in the extra semiotic reality. To use Austen's example, when the bridal couple say, "I do," at a wedding ceremony, their status changes and both parties are from this moment married. The utterance has brought about an absolute change. Vocalization may be implied in Austen's treatment of performatives, but he does not explicitly discuss the role of voice. In retrospective self-analysis based on my interlocutors' assessments of voice memory, some prisoners described what resemble two Austinian performativities in elective affinity with one another. There was first the prophetic radio voice, which was perceived to act upon the world. Some prisoners believed the words "pronto serás libre" would result in their release. Pronto serás libre, soon you will be free. Second, the recycling of radio voices in inner speech intermingled with prayer resulted in what prisoners believed to be the voice of God, speaking the verbatim of a previous radio message. God's presence had been cultivated through the sensorial impact of the radio voice. My general thesis in this paper will be as follows. Despite what the hostages implied, it is impossible conceptually to tease apart voice and the words uttered by the voice, for it is the speaking voice that enables the content to come into being, even if the pointers of voice might inflect the meaning. However, in such a context of captivity and intentional listening, captives considered the radio voice, or the indexical footprints of voice and not the words, to serve the primary performative function. The pragmatic authority came from the voice. The disembodied radio voice was an index of a more perfect order that captives knew existed despite all the troubles of the present. The captives were trying to form a relationship with an invisible other, perhaps God. In doing so, the voice was perceived to be the vehicle of agency. In what might be described as multi-layered performative listening, the hostages did things with voices, not words, as in Austen's dictum, by which it is meant they reimagined the radio voices and assigned them new identities. Some of these prisoners believed they were hearing the voice of God, but God's words came from the radio messages. As we will see later from Raphael's account and from Fernando's previous reference to being literally touched by the voice, it seems that this was a case of Connor's paradoxical principle, which states, the more we concentrate upon one sense, the more likely it is that synesthetic spillings and minglings may occur. This spillover principle echoed in a number of my interviews, where captives explained how the radio voice was both remembered and experienced. Here is such an example where a former hostage reflecting on the radio voice appears to be investing it with certain powers. Author, or that's me, you mentioned the power of these messages. What did you mean by that? Eduardo, well, I knew the distinctive sound of my wife's voice would end in my release. Her words echoed across the jungle in the middle of the night. She would address me directly. For a couple of minutes, there was the voice of my beloved wife. I could feel it. It was all mine. Everybody listening heard it, but the message was directed at me. Her voice was calm and confident. It took all my fears away. It turned me to the future. In the days after the message, I would think about her voice. It would fill me with joy. It was all I had to look forward to. I would wait all week to hear her voice the following Saturday. But sometimes I was frustrated and upset when I could not remember her words. I believed her voice would change everything. Author, was it her voice alone that had this power, or was it what she had to say? Eduardo, I don't know why, but I often struggle to remember her exact words. If I ever had a pen and paper, I would write them down afterwards. But her voice was always in my mind. I would replay it in my mind when I felt low. It is difficult to describe how important that voice in my head was, but I believe that voice could do everything. It would get me out of the jungle. Sometimes I felt if the guards heard it, they would have been struck by it. I came to believe they would do something, act upon it, if they heard it. That's an extract from the interview with Eduardo, who was held captive by the FARC for 7 years. Colombian hostage reflexive self-analyses such as these reveal a complex prisoner discourse that reproduced familiar voices on the radio bound up in acoustic memory, speculation, and mimetic response. Shortly after their capture, many of the hostages were given a radio to help deter suicide or insurrection. Suicide would mean loss of a lucrative ransom. The hostages of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, based on its initials in Spanish, held in the Amazon rainforest, radio voices were infused into inner speech. Las voces en mi cabeza. These voices were then recycled in a dialogic interaction with prayer. Dialogic for this type of listening attended to the implicit intention behind the speaker's voice and words. Bakhtin argued that all utterances have an inherently dialogic character. Both Bakhtin and Voloshinov believed that dialogicity affected the very structure of language. But what if it is not known whether the listener can hear the speaker? Voloshinov said that the shape of utterances is always shaped by the potential of the listener to respond. The hostage's response to a radio message was typically in the form of inner speech that was bound up in the reproduction of radio voices. This paper aims to take up such localized ideologies of voice that emerge from these interviews and considers the hostages' retrospective reflections on performativity to explore the way a voice can be perceived to do things in the world. Performativity has been used in anthropology to describe how gender is constructed, how human agency and personhood are intimately linked, how the semantic basis of rituals and magic is essentially similar to performative acts, as well as to outline how ethnographic conceptualism interacts with performativity theory, and even to analyze how performativities were used in a historical context to formalize the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Findings from prisoner ethnographies of voice add to this body of research by approaching performativity and linguistic representations of God from the perspective of agency. Agency in the sense of the ability to bring about effects and reconstitute the world. However, my main contribution is a methodological one. By considering the voice of the speaker, I'm adding the dimension of vocality to speech act theory and explaining how this can be significant. Now, I believe this research is important, for it takes Austin's ideas in a new direction by showing how voice alone can serve the primary performative function. This study also complements existing research on the ethnography of hostage taking by introducing uniquely the perspectives of reflexive self-analysis. Let us now turn to the ethnographic backdrop to this research. A series of structured and unstructured interviews with former hostages, their families, and former members of the FARC were conducted in the summer of 2018. My interest in the project grew out of my previous fieldwork on the anthropology of radio, and through meeting and getting to know Ingrid Betancourt, who was a former Colombian presidential candidate who was captured by the FARC and held for a number of years in the Amazon rainforest. After her dramatic rescue, she returned to Europe and subsequently became a PhD student in theology at the University of Oxford, as well as a longer-term informant in this project. I spent 2 months interviewing former hostages who now live principally in Bogota, Medellin, Cali, Cartagena, and Popayán. Especially helpful to my research were Fernando, who was a former general in the Colombian army, Jaime, who was a former member of the Colombian Senate, Pedro, who was a former minister in President Uribe's government, Valentina, who was an employee at Unidad para las Víctimas, Eduardo, who is a former politician, now a lawyer, and Rafael, who is a former Colombian congressman. Valentina's husband was one of the Cali politicians who was kidnapped from the assembly and killed by the FARC in a botched prisoner exchange after many years of captivity. His daughter, who was 2 years old when he was taken captive, had only known him acoustically. She sent him a radio message every week. Once a year, the FARC let him send a video message to his family, where he spoke of the joy the radio messages gave him. All of these people listed above were held captive for long periods of time, between 7 and 11 years. For this reason, and sometimes because of the dramatic nature of their release, and indeed capture, they became well-known figures in Colombia. The most useful person for my research was the Voces de Secuestro DJ and former hostage Heribin Hoyos. At the end of my stay, Heribin introduced me to former members of the FARC, one of whom had become a dissident of the organization and left radio messages asking for forgiveness for the crimes he had committed. He left a message from his prison cell and was connected on air with the wife of a man who he had murdered. Live on Voces de Secuestro, he confessed to the murder, and she forgave him, saying that the conflict in Colombia must come to an end, that the country must accept and move on from past atrocities. I also interviewed a number of policemen who were held for shorter periods of time. In total, I interviewed over 30 former hostages. Many of the radio messages are available online. The messages that predate 2012 are on tapes and are the property of Heribin Hoyos. The hostages who claimed to have heard the voice of God were all Catholics and typically came from conservative middle-class backgrounds. This is relevant because their notion of a Catholic God is grounded more in notions of hierarchy. This sense of hierarchy was central to how they classified the voices they believed they heard and in helping them endure their ordeal. For these prisoners, being Catholic meant primarily an indexing of personal faith and proximity to the divine, which was brought about through the cultivation of a spiritual habitus, invoking the Passion of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and various saints. Attesting to an implicit theology and an effective relationship to God, prayer was a means for a variety of agents, hostages, families of hostages, and the Catholic Church to act upon the world in a time of crisis. Prayer is the spiritual discipline that introduces and directs us to the sacred dimension, and most hostages felt as if they were living in some kind of spiritual void. One former hostage told me that the life of captivity in the rainforest was not conducive to spiritual thinking. He said the reason for this was what he perceived to be the chronomatic monotony of the rainforest. Everything is brown, he said. The radio voice was imbued with performative powers and a culture of listening, not culture in the traditional anthropological sense, but in the sense of an emerging culture of captivity. For some, this was a form of solitary listening practice. For others, where radio was shared and sometimes concealed, it was a group listening practice. Radios were concealed because the FARC would remove them as a form of punishment. As we will see, the circumstances of listening to the radio voice in the dead of the night in the Colombian rainforest resulted in an intensification of the auditory experience. Among the hostages, there were a plurality of listeners. There were those for whom the Saturday night messages were their only source of hope. There were casual listeners who did not receive messages, what Goffman calls unratified listeners, but were curious to identify callers. And as we will come on to see, there were even listeners for whom the voice embodied a spiritual dimension. The conditions that the hostages were kept in determined to some degree the modes of listening. Those who were kept in isolation experienced the most intense modes of listening, which resulted in multiple layers of auditory knowledge that played into the connection between God and the inhumanity of war. Those who were kept in pairs or small groups were less likely to fetishize the voice and indulge in elaborate auditory imagination. During 50 years of conflict, the FARC and other guerrilla groups, such as the EON, kidnapped approximately 40,000 people. A peace agreement was signed in 2016 between the FARC and the Colombian government. The EON were not signatories to the agreement. It was hoped the peace process would bring to an end the longest-running armed conflict in the Western Hemisphere. This armed insurrection has its roots in a Marxist uprising that sought a social transformation of Colombia. Over time, the FARC benefited from aspects of the drug trade, and the conflict became as much about criminal activities surrounding the lucrative drug market and land as any Marxist ideology. Despite the peace agreement, violence in Colombia continues, however, with right-wing paramilitary groups assassinating demobilized members of the FARC. Over the last 3 years in particular, a large number of social leaders and indigenous activists have been killed in Colombia. Broadly speaking, the prisoners of the FARC comprise 3 groups. Firstly, high-profile political prisoners. Secondly, policemen and members of the Colombian, and thirdly, members of the Colombian army. The latter 2 groups were normally kept in large groups in pens, whereas political prisoners were either kept in isolation or small groups comprising up to 4 people. Some of the captives were kept in cages, others were for periods of time tied to trees, and some slept in very small guarded wooden huts. Most of the hostages I met tried to escape at some point. The captors realized that a radio would help calm a hostage as it would give him or her a connection with the world beyond the rainforest, and thus made the life of the guard easier. The guards were typically aged between 14 and 17 and were sometimes coerced to join the FARC. Many came from villages along the Choco Pacific coast, the poorest part of Colombia. These miners were given an alias and became life members of the FARC. About 40% of them were girls. Without the radio, the FARC would have been unable to manage a complex network of hostages in the Amazon rainforest and indeed operate as an organization. Radio was what Latour calls an actor network, a constant source of information with many different actors and shifting participant roles and interactions. Hostages, former hostages, families and friends of hostages, the FARC, former FARC rebels and other guerrilla groups. About 50 messages were broadcast every week on Voces de Secuestro, but in the 1990s, when far larger numbers were taken hostage, there were as many as 100 messages. Caracol Radio, the radio station that ran Voces de Secuestro, gave speakers 2 minutes to read their message. Friends and families of the hostages who had traveled 15 hours from the Pacific coast on the bus got 15 minutes because they had made such an effort to get to the studio. Radio played such a pivotal role in the conflict, even radio technicians were kidnapped so that they could repair the guerrillas' radios. Radio and the constant need for batteries became part of the material culture of the rainforest. Hostages used to carefully ration their radio listening, constantly conscious of the need to save battery life for the Voces de Secuestro program. Close to the outside world, the social world of the rainforest where the hostages were kept could be associated with a set of specific experiences. Shared behaviors between the hostages and guerrillas could be framed in terms of virality. Many of the FARC guards were illiterate. Occasionally, books made it into the rainforest and were given to the hostages to keep them occupied and quiet, but for the most part, they were dependent on the radio voice for every source of information, intelligence, and entertainment. At night, the hostages would be exposed to the absolute proximity of the radio voice. With the absent performativity of gesture and facial expression, it was just the radio voice that was left to penetrate the senses, and it was the sounds of a familiar voice that made the hostages feel existentially significant again. Raphael wrote poetry throughout his captivity. The inspiration for his poetry came from 3 sources: the radio messages, the occasional book of poetry that he received, and the sounds of the trees. His experience of 7 years in captivity was one that was wedded to certain acoustic experiences and not much more. Let us now turn our attention specifically to these acoustic experiences. As we've seen, a particular radio voice was perceived to be performative and not the words. This performativity manifested itself in different ways. A message might end with "Reza a Dios, mi amor," and the hostage would cross himself and pray to God. "Mira al cielo y disfrutar de las estrellas, disfrutar de los pájaros y animales que te rodean." And the hostage would look up at the sky, the stars, the birds, and the animals around him. However, a number of my interlocutors, such as Rafael and Fernando, spoke of how hearing a radio voice led subsequently to events that resulted in a positive change for the captive. A few days before Fernando's release, his wife left a message on the radio which suggested he would soon be released and ended with "Dios, hágase tu voluntad, estoy en tus manos." God, may your will prevail, I am in your hands. As we will see, I take these to be performativities that became subsequently enmeshed in prisoners' inner discourse and prayer and the pertinent issue here is the performativity of the hostage's inner speech that followed from listening to the familiar radio voice. John Austin spoke of the perlocutionary effect of an utterance, which refers to the external effect on the hearer. The belief that a voice alone could actually bring about a change in the hostage's circumstances had its origins in rumors. Rumors circulated in the rainforest that radio messages predicting an end to the hostage's captivity had indeed resulted in the prisoner's release. These were not just rumors, but a kind of speech act in themselves. Raphael was released after his wife reported on a radio message that she had dreamt of his imminent release. Listeners in the rainforest subscribed to the efficacy of language on the radio, its power and appeal being perhaps that it stemmed from a disembodied voice. Through constantly reproducing his wife's voice in his inner speech, Fernando believed that her words were endowed with a perlocutionary force. However, such utterances did not presumably amount to felicitous declarations, for the intentionality was only perceived by the listener. According to John Searle, in order to be successful, a speech act needs to also comply with the preparatory condition. This condition requires the speech act to be embedded in a conventionally recognized context where the listeners mutually agree on the performativity of the words uttered. A speech act will not occur just because the words are spoken, even if the listener believed the assertion, "Soon you will be free, pronto serás libre," to be sincere. What were perceived to be prophetic radio voices were not therefore explicit performatives, since they were not reducible to a form such as "I set you free" in a procedural context. Conceptually, one might consider whether it is possible to have a speech act on the radio with the speaker and the listener spatially distinct. Relevant to this, there was a debate in the 1970s in Roman Catholic circles about the efficacy of blessings and other sacramental formulae, notably the sacramental hoc est corpus, which coincides with and signals transubstantiation, if when a mass is heard on the replay of a recording. There was a doctrinal concern only when the speech act was displaced in time, i.e. from replay of a recording, rather than in space. Thus, there was no concern about the efficacy of a blessing, etc., heard when broadcast by radio. The issue of immediacy seems to be linked with efficacy, and the temporal seems to be deemed more important than the spatial. For hostages such as Fernando, who was a former general in the Colombian army, and Rafael, a former Colombian congressman, language became largely internalized as they reproduced these displaced speech acts. Internal speech was not a product of disembodied silence, but a result of echoic mimicry of radio voices. Their daily lives were characterized by an inner monologue of thinking and not external speech. External speech was only used in occasional communication with the guards. These conversations are normally brief and responses to imperatives. At night, their acoustic world switched from one speech situation to another. Silence to listening to the radio voice, and then back to silence. In this context, a disembodied radio voice was perceived by the hostages to be a guarantor of truth and self-presence, an index for authenticity, and not just a channel to relay a message. The radio voice had become part of the prisoner's collective auditory consciousness. Such interpretations take us away from the ascription of cultural meaning to voice and emphasize instead the personal ascription of force to voice. The radio voice was assumed for some a transcendental realm too. Raphael, who received regular messages from his wife, described how he felt as if he was in God, en Dios. Los audiciones fueron una bendición del cielo. The messages were a blessing from heaven. The immediacy of the radio message was for him akin to experiencing divinity. Many messages resembled prayers addressed to the Señor, to the Lord. Que Señor te bendiga. May the Lord bless you. Most messages start by thanking the Lord or God. They speak of God compensating the hostage with freedom. For him, these messages were like a somatic flow with a physical sensation of warmth, electricity, and tingling. They were acousmatic voices, a voice without an apparent corporeal origin, but without any disturbing undertones. Many of the former hostages prayed to God, and some heard the voice of God. These hostages were adamant in claiming that hearing what they believed to be God was not some form of hallucination or a form of inner speech that they did not recognize as self-produced. The sense of a divine presence was only aural, and among these captives there was not an idiom of an intimate back and forth conversation with God. Prayer was their supplication of the divine, but also a means of empowerment. The FARC guards were Marxist atheists. In sharp contrast to this, the highly institutionalized form of Catholicism left some hostages feeling empowered by invoking various saints and the Virgin Mary in their prayers. Ingrid Betancourt described her escape on the radio as a miracle of the Virgin Mary. Here's an extract from the interview with Raphael. Author, you said you believed you heard the voice of God. How did this come about? Raphael, yes, it was in the middle of the night. After listening to my wife's radio messages, I would be trying to sleep, thinking about her messages, her presence on air. And then I heard somebody speak to me, an external voice. The guard was asleep. I did not recognize the voice. It was calm, soothing, uninterruptible. It addressed me using my first name. Nobody used that name on the messages. It was a man's voice. It did not promise anything. It said I should stay calm, that everything would be fine, and that I should look around me and see the beautiful things, the birds, the trees. How did you know it was the voice of God? Raphael, there was no doubt in my mind. It could not have been anything else. I heard it on just 3 occasions after hearing the radio messages and after prayer. It was a powerful presence. I never heard the voice after my release. I never heard it when there was no radio because the batteries were dead. That voice gave me great confidence. It changed everything. Did you try to respond to the voice? Raphael, not initially. I was so spellbound by the voice. I did try subsequently, but there was no response. It was just a voice, but the voice was always compatible with my emotions. It was not a conversation, and this voice was quite distinct from my internal voice. Hearing God's voice was perceived to be directly motivated by the radio voice. The speaker would instruct the hostage to escuchar la voz de Dios, which became a refrain in these messages, listen to the voice of God. A few hostages said they heard subsequently an audible voice, but as they were kept in isolation, nobody was able to corroborate their accounts. Pedro, a former minister in President Uribe's government, described the voice of God as internal and personal. He did not believe it was an internal thought, but clearly it was not always straightforward, distinguishing between an internal thought and an internalized voice belonging to somebody else. Fernando told me it was as if God was listening to Voces de Secuestro, the radio program. After his release, his wife insisted that God had listened to her prayers on the radio. Instead of using a hyperchoristic such as Hermosito, my little love, more typical of these messages from their families, the voice addressed them using their first names. The feelings of anger, revenge, and rancor that inevitably arose occasionally during their ordeal had been extinguished by the voice. Hostages such as Raphael and Jaime talked about the love they felt after hearing the voice. There was no better source of comfort, Raphael said. The voice did not make any promises or speak of an imminent release. The effect of the voice was sufficiently sublime, they kept trying to reproduce it in their inner speech. All of those who claimed to have heard the voice of God spoke of how they could internalize this voice and switch it on in moments of despair. These political hostages were held captive for so many years, these political hostages who were held captive for so many years were doing things with voices, inserting words into the magical voice that reverberated in their minds. Experiential evangelical Christianity comes to mind when one thinks of God responding to prayers. Tanya Luhrmann's work with white evangelical communities in the USA is perhaps best known in this regard. Her informants trained using inner voice conversations with God. However, none of the hostages described their Christian upbringing as evangelical. What is more, they were unaware that evangelical Christians can often be heard denigrating Catholicism for formalism. Far from being a conduit to God, the inner voice was for most simply a channel for rational thinking, as well as a means of concealing their thoughts and plans from their captors. However, some hostages told me they like to remind themselves of the fact that the words of God can directly change the world, the ultimate speech act. Let there be light, and the sun appears, etc. They understood the difference between God's speech and man's speech is that the latter depends on the action of another to cause the change. Those who heard the voice of God said it would have been impossible without radio messages. The voice was a source of sonic and spiritual embodiment. Tanya Luhrmann calls this process whereby people can experience what is not materially present as absorption. The radio messages helped bring about this absorption as well as novel forms of sensory perception. Absorption was, of course, part of the story, but stress, loneliness, and fear were, of course, important factors as well. Similarly, some evangelical Christian radio programs in America try to invoke such perceptions. One of them, it's called My Faith Radio, tells its listeners that they need to sharpen their senses in order to hear God's voice. They suggest that hearing God's voice is about humility. You need to be poor in spirit, become like a child again, and be familiar with the words of God. In the words of these faith radio DJs, the two features of God's talk are self-denial and giving to others. Some evangelical Christians liken God's voice to a radio frequency. For them, the radio station is always broadcasting, but in order to hear the radio voice, you need to tune into the frequency. It is a way of listening. Listeners wishing to hear God are often told that they should sit quietly, remove all distractions, be patient, and read the Bible. For a number of hostages, this was basically their life in captivity. It was not an emptiness, but more of a communicative silence waiting to be filled. Whether it be God, a loved one's voice on the radio, or the internalized voice of a relative, it was the voice of the one they could not see that mattered. Voice is associated with individuality, agency, and authority. Only recently has voice emerged as a focus of ethnographic research. By analyzing the impact of the radio voice, we are accessing the structures of immediacy and the ontology of an acoustic presence for radio represented the umbilical continuity of voice. It is clear that any study of voice must engage with an anthropology of listening, for the impact of the voice is to be found in the way that the listener responds to it. This ethnography showed that the first few syllables of a familiar voice triggered an experiential vision, conveying a whole gamut of memories, emotions, associations, and opinions. It is the voice that brings about the presence of the speaker, not the choice of words. Hostages reproduce the voice, once described by one of my interlocutors as un cuerpo viviente, a living body, subsequently in their internal speech. One hostage described in her interviews with me radio messages like extracts from the genesis of life in her mind. She and others, such as Jaime, focused on the sonorous quality of speech, for this was the index for how the speaker was feeling. Jaime had a purely acoustic relationship with his daughter-in-law. His son had married during his captivity, and he had not met her. Through her magica, through her magical voice, he felt as if he could imagine what she looked like, what kind of person she was. The associative connections and mental visions that stem from speech became much more refined in this context. The radio had a psychological grip on the hostages, for it brought to life the embodied singularity of voice. Through voice, we reveal who we are. And so when these voices were heard speaking the words, pronto serás libre, Dios, escuchar tu oración, escuchar la voz de Dios, They became speech events filled with the reality of life. The social life of the hostage was framed in terms of certain experiential temporalities. These 2-minute radio messages as speech events. 7 years of imprisonment in the case of a number of high-profile political prisoners. The weekly radio show. And the conflict, which many hoped would come to an end in 2016 after 52 years. Ultimately, their captivity was characterized by long periods of dead time interspersed with sounds of radio voices. For some of the hostages of the FARC, the radio voice resulted in a form of life awakening, triggering an experiential vision. Certain captives who placed all their faith in these messages came to believe the sonic materiality of speech, a familiar voice, had a performative power. Not only did they believe a specific radio voice could result in their release, but once it became intermingled with prayer and extended inner speech, it resulted occasionally in what some perceived to be the voice of God. Through engaging with localized ideologies of voice, captives reimagined the radio voices and assigned them new identities. As with many long-term prisoners held in isolation, these hostages developed what Bakhtin would have called an internally persuasive discourse, the monologue that lasts the whole life, as he said. They established a complex and intimate relationship with disembodied radio voices and the voice of God, which is one of these manifestations. Some hostages believed you could do things with radio voices in an Austinian sense. They also understood that without the radio voice, there would have been no voice of God. This piece of research shows how voice is embodied in the performative speech act, and in doing so, it advances Austin's ideas as opposed to merely using them. These reflexive self-analyses of acoustic memory add to the small number of studies on groups that claim to have heard the voice of God. Thus far, most research in this domain has focused on evangelical Christians. Typically, these communities have been trained to hear the voice of God. However, research with Colombian hostages shows that inner voice can be used to invoke linguistic representations of God in the absence of any tuition. This rich and until now unanalyzed discography of radio messages is thus an expose of the singularity of voice in a particularly intense sonic environment that merits further analysis. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Now
don't ask me to translate it.
Yeah, the floor is, okay, the floor is open, so questions, comments, whatever you like.
I would like to clarify something. I want to understand what kind of things you could do with voice, with radio voice. So it's still kind of blurry to me. What do you mean?
Well, it's not what I could do, but what the hostages could do. Yeah. I think in order to understand that question, let's think about the context. Okay. So these are high profile, for the large part, these are high profile politicians, quite well known people in Colombia. And of course, the FARC chose to take these people hostage because obviously the ransom is bigger for the more well known the individual, the bigger the ransom. Yeah. These people were taken to the jungle, to the Amazon rainforest, and kept in, particularly these people were kept in isolation, sometimes tied to trees for years, typically between 7 and 11 years.
So you mean all the time they were chained to trees?
More or less, yeah. Yeah, so this was, a terrible existence. But imagine the acoustic environment in which they were held. So they were there in the jungle. At night, it was absolutely silent. It was absolutely pitch black. Sometimes they would go days without communicating really with anyone. They would just have basic communication with the guards. And the guards were illiterate, totally uneducated, normally teenagers. But as I say, the guards tended to give them a radio because they knew that would keep the hostage quiet and keep them happy. And it meant that they could have some contact with the outside world. So if you can imagine being tied to a tree, kept in isolation in the jungle, apart from your family and friends and everyone for years at a time, and all you have is this voice, this radio voice of a loved one coming. So I didn't mention this, but the reception is best at night between the hours of, in the Amazon jungle, between the hours of 2 and 5 o'clock in the morning. So they would stay up all night, and there would be hundreds of these messages sometimes, particularly in the 1990s. This radio program ran for 28 years. And they would stay up all night, waiting for that familiar voice, normally of a wife or husband, normally of a wife or a child or a mother. And so it's perhaps not surprising that these voices had a very powerful dimension for these hostages. But of course, what is unexpected is what happened to these voices and what they did with these voices. So these, subsequently, they would have to wait a whole week to potentially hear that voice again. But sometimes they may have to wait months, because not everybody left a message every week. Some of these captives got a message every week. Fernando got a message every week for 11 years from his wife. Others, maybe one message a month, and so on. So it wasn't always consistently every week. So what would happen during this week, acoustically or sonically, they would be trying to sort of reprogram these voices that they heard, because it was a source of comfort, it was a source of strength, it was all they had to hold on to cling on to. And what I'm saying here, what I established here, what I ascertained through these interviews I did in Colombia, is that I discovered that in some cases, a small number of cases, but only 3 or 4 cases, after listening to these radio messages, people, only Catholics, by the way, and very, devout Catholics. Three of my interlocutors were devout Catholics, and they claimed that they heard a voice subsequently, an external voice. It was in the middle of the night, after the radio program had ended at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. They couldn't remember the words normally, but they believed the words came from the radio program, but the voice, they weren't hallucinating. I mean, they suffered bouts of malaria, and there were times when they were hallucinating, but when they heard this voice, they claimed they weren't hallucinating, but they believed this was the voice of God, and they believed the voice of God came about because their mind was recycling and copying and mimicking the previous radio voices of their loved ones they heard. So the question is, well, what do we do with this? So I've put this in the context of pragmatics and John Austin's speech act theory, dating from 1962, because they spoke in their interviews, they were talking about the voice, not the words, but the voice having this certain kind of power, and potentially a kind of performative power. So there were hostages who believed that if they heard the voice of their wife, in all 3 cases, and she said, pronto serás libre, soon you will be free. They came to believe that this would have a performative power, i.e. that would actually result in their release.
The promise of hope. I guess the performative power would be the promise of hope.
Of course, as I said in the paper, they're not, in the pragmatic sense, they're not true performativities, because for a speech act to be performative, so I use the example of when a couple get married in the church. So in England, the man says, I do, will you marry blah, 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 I do. Will you marry blah, 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 I do. After that, you are married, your status has changed. Those words, I do, are what John Austin called performatives. Performatives in the sense that those words repeated in that strict formulaic context bring about a change. But John Austin didn't say anything about voice. And I'm wondering, well, conceptually, you can't really tease apart voice and words, can you? I mean, when you hear me speak now, you hear a voice and you hear the words, but you can't just hear the words or just hear the voice. Not really. It's difficult to tease them apart. But my informants were talking about voice. They weren't talking about, normally they were talking about voice. Normally they couldn't reproduce the verbatim, the words that they believed were God. They couldn't remember what God was talking about. Not very often, at least, but they had this voice. So conceptually, my question is, can voice alone be performative in the pragmatic sense of John Austin? But by the way, I mentioned John Searle. So John Searle was also a pragmatist. He lived, well, he's still alive, but his work was later than John Austin's. And John Searle said, okay, well, we have these speech acts. So another example of a speech act is when you launch a ship. In English, all ships are female, by the way. I don't know if you know. They always have girls' names. So we at least smash a bottle against the ship and say, I name this ship Christina of Moscow or whatever. You know, you smash the bottle of champagne. The status of the ship has changed in a sense. You know, that she has received a name. It's like a baptism. It's like a christening kind of thing. So that would be another example of a speech act. But John Searle said a speech act can only be a speech act if it is felicitous. I mean, that's a fancy word, but by felicitous, he just meant there has to be this strict formulaic context.
Cultural context.
Yes, which has to be repeated time and time again. So, you know, hypothetically, if Maria and I were to get married now, and I say I do, and you say I do, that wouldn't be a performative because you can't get married in this context, and we're not at, what's it called, Zach's, and we're not at the church, and etc. So that wouldn't be felicitous. Yeah, that wouldn't be a felicitous speech act.
And so your question is whether we could think of it as a performative act, of voice as a performative act, because there are no cultural contexts.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, in a way, it's I'm not sure if I'm seriously asking this question sort of theoretically, because I mean, we can answer it, can't we? We can say, well, voice alone can't be performative. Not, or at least it's difficult to think of a context where it could be. But in the view, of course, the Colombian hostages, they don't know anything about pragmatics and performativity, but in the way they were talking about their captivity, it sounded to me as if they were talking about precisely that, which is why I got interested in this subject.
I think in certain religious contexts, for example, voice in the desert, as it usually appears in religious experience, it could be grasped as a performative act, I think, because.
But which change in circumstances is that evoking? What actually changes? Because for it to be a performative, there needs to be. I mean, the change here is potentially their release. And the reason I mention that is because there was an example of a hostage who was kept in the jungle for over 10 years, and one Saturday evening his wife came on to the radio program, Voces de Secuestro, said, "Pronto serás libre, soon you will be released." 4 days later he was released. And the hostages, don't forget that the rainforest is huge, it's massive, and 40,000 people were taken hostage throughout the history of this conflict. So if you can imagine, you know, the rainforest, I mean, dotted around the rainforest were all these hostages, but they're all listening to the radio, you see. So, and these rumors and these hostages were moved around quite a lot. The high-profile ones were particularly moved around a lot because they were constantly worried that the Colombian army would find out where they were. And so these rumors circulate. I mean, it sounds implausible, but these rumors circulated in the Colombian rainforest about, not specifically about the performativity of the messaging, but about the idea that, you know, did you hear Fernando's wife on the radio? She said soon he was released, and he was released a few days later. And if you're absolutely desperate, if you've been kept in appalling conditions for years after years, then I think you just you grasp any source of hope, you know. And in this case, the hope was something acoustic.
Any other question? Yeah, I have a brief comment and a couple brief questions. First of all, thank you very much. It was fascinating. Secondly, what I thought was actually getting to in terms of religious and mystical experiences, I think there are not exact analogs, but something very similar if you look at Christian magical practices in Neoplatonic context in the 2nd century. I'm not sure about Latin pronunciation. Vocus magica, I think it is. The vocalizations that they're not really words. There's no content, just sounds. Achieving magical effects through just the power of the voice itself. It's not the same, obviously, but while we're talking, I couldn't help but come back to this idea again and again, because there is a similarity. It's just the voice, what changes the world around you. But I also have two really brief questions just to understand the context better. First of all, about the hostages who were kept as a collective, not the important prisoners, but the police, I think you mentioned, the army personnel. Did they have access to the radio? Did they also listen to this program, or did they maybe even tweet some of them? How was it perceived among the people who were not necessarily as well?
Yeah, so they did have access to the radio, but it was a very different kind of listening, because the policemen, generally speaking, I mean, many policemen were taken hostage, but generally people of sort of lower public profile, so not politicians and not wealthy businessmen and what have you, were kept in pens in large groups, and they shared a radio. So often quite a large number would be listening to a radio on the Saturday evening. And interestingly, I'm not quite sure the reason for this, but these people generally receive fewer messages than the higher profile politicians and what have you. So I think their mode of listening was slightly different. It was less intense, I would say. And there were also, I think I may have mentioned this in the paper, sometimes conflicts arose. So if one of the hostages was punished for some reason, there could be various reasons, such as trying to escape, for instance, then the radio would be taken away from them, confiscated, and then that would lead to fighting within the groups and what have you. So they were, there's a lot of interesting biographies written by many of these, I've read many of these books by these high-profile captives, and they always talk about the radio and how they were absolutely the batteries of the radio were, because the batteries only lasted certain, and so people became very angry if, for instance, as you know, Colombians love football, and of course football was often on the radio. So if people were listening to the football, even though they loved football, they didn't want anybody to listen to the football because they knew they would drain the batteries, you know. So they had to keep the batteries for the Saturday evening Voces de Secuestro program. So you can imagine that led to all kinds of conflicts. Yeah. So, but your example is great, and I'm really looking for more examples of, you know, this. It's conceptually it's quite difficult, isn't it? As I say, to just sort of hear a voice and not the words, but I think there are religious contexts where
it's a mystical experience.
It's a mystical experience, yeah.
Like people all over the world eat all sorts of strange mushrooms and do all kinds of interesting stuff just to hear the voice without hearing the words. And in extreme situations can produce mystical experiences. I think this is very close to it.
Yeah.
And the second question I had was about guards. And here I just don't quite understand the situation. I mean, did the guards also listen to the same radio, like when the program, the Spanish name, which I can't pronounce, was on? Did the guards listen in, or
yeah,
were very far?
That's a good question. Yeah, and that's a question I asked my informants, and I got different answers. Often the answer was no, they weren't particularly interested. Sometimes the answer was yes. And the reason is quite interesting is that in a way, the guards were also hostages, because they were often, I mean, the FARC, this terrorist organization, it does most, or historically, it did most of its recruiting in the Choco region, which is the western, I should have a map, but it's the western Colombia, it's the poorest part of Colombia on the Atlantic coast, sorry, on the Pacific coast. And they went around these very, very poor villages and basically took hostage children, and not so much children, but sort of teenagers, typically between the ages of 13 and 16. And they, in a way, they also lived a life, I mean, of course, they weren't tied to trees, but in a way, they also lived a life of captivity, because they were stuck in the rainforest as well. They couldn't leave the rainforest. So I mention that because sometimes the mothers of these poor teenagers left messages for them.
Oh.
So there's various cycles here of.
I wonder if it's possible to get into with some former guards, because you mentioned some time in the beginning that they were atheists, and
Yes. Yeah.
honestly, I'm not sure if it's possible. I mean, teenagers from rural communities in a Catholic country, and they are like firmly convinced atheists.
Oh, but that's part of the sort of the FARC brainwashing, if you like. I mean, they may have come from Catholic backgrounds.
But that should still influence them in some way. You don't just remove the whole cultural background of something like that. But I mean,
Yeah.
it would be so interesting to read here about that.
Yeah, I did meet former members of the FARC.
Oh.
And it was, I've written about it in various places. It was an extraordinary experience, and it was unexpected. But basically what happened was Heribin Hoyos, who set up this radio program, tragically died of COVID last year. But it took me 3 months to meet him in Colombia. When I met him, I realized why it took 3 months to meet him. They were basically constantly trying to assassinate him. He had 4 phones lined up, and they were flashing. I met him in the Marriott Hotel in Bogota, and he came in with huge security. There were dogs outside and everything. And I recognized him immediately, and he came in and he sat down, and all these phones were lighting up. And then I realized basically what's happened. I mean, Heribin Hoyos, he had basically become the civil intelligence of Colombia, because he had set up this program. He'd run this program for 28 years. He knew these many of the hostages personally. He knew what had happened to them. He knew all kinds of stories. And after the conflict ended officially in 2016, I mean, tens of thousands of people were killed, right? And the members and the families of the deceased wanted justice, and they didn't know where to get. The Colombian government didn't have the information about these hostages. I mean, so he was basically the civil intelligence of the country, and we had a very interesting conversation, and then 2 men with like big sunglasses and baseball caps entered the Marriott Hotel, and he sort of went like this and pointed to the corner of the hotel. I had no idea what was going on. He disappeared, and he came back, and he said, "Why don't you come and join us? This is going to be interesting." I had no idea who these men were, and he took me to the corner of the room, and he said something like, "We're amongst friends." He said, "Gentlemen, like, remove your glasses, remove your hats. This is Stephen. He's an anthropologist from Oxford." And turned out these guys were former members of the FARC who were now working for the government. They're working for government intelligence, and they were giving. They knew about all the drug trafficking routes, and yeah, it was quite an interesting afternoon. I was taken out the back exit. I was flying out of the country that evening, and I was taken out of the back exit of the hotel and put into bulletproof car and driven very fast to the airport. My head was spinning.
Okay, any more questions?
You're a risky person.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have a little question about the condition of life. Hostages. Do they actually did they live in absolutely loneliness despite of the guards, or they live in some communities, or they have, did they have an opportunity to communicate with each other in this way?
Yeah, so it depended very much on what kind of hostage it was. So to take the example of Ingrid Betancourt, who was this presidential candidate, who, by the way, was taken hostage during the campaign trail. She was campaigning in 2008, I think it was. And they took her, they kidnapped her and took her into the jungle. And so she and many other high-profile prisoners were, she spent some years, I think 3 or 4 years, she was living in a very tiny little hut, which she shared with another woman. Then she was kept in isolation for some time. She was tied to trees for some time. Other prisoners, less profile prisoners, such as the policeman that I mentioned, would tend to be held in quite large groups in pens. Basically, the higher the profile of the prisoner, the more likely that they were moved around the jungle. So some of these high profile prisoners, such as Ingrid Betancourt, lived in 5, 6, or 7 different locations. Sometimes they were moved every few months or so, if they believed the Colombian army were about to find out where they were kept. So they were kept in pretty unpleasant conditions. All of the people I interviewed and got to know, all of them suffered multiple bouts of malaria. Many of them suffered this disease called leptospirosis, which is when insects get under your skin and you can lose your eyesight and horrible things can happen. And of course, all the other kind of tropical diseases. I mean, there were very rudimentary. There was some kind of field hospital somewhere in the Amazon that the FARC ran, but it was, as you might imagine, very, very rudimentary. So I think it wasn't so much that they were, I mean, they weren't sort of tortured or that kind of thing, but the most sort of common characteristic of their captivity was its absolute boredom, I think. Just the fact that there was just nothing to do, and they were just and just the absolute sort of isolation and the silence, which I think all of these factors compound the sort of the acoustic effect of the radio voice. They weren't really given any work to do. I mean, they weren't sort of put to the work. It wasn't like some kind of labor camp. It really was just sort of kept in isolation. Just absolute boredom. Yeah. I mean, Ingrid Betancourt, who I'm still in touch with, and I got to know her quite well. She had, when she was taken captive, she had 2 children aged, I think, about 8 and 11. Mm-hmm. And for her, the biggest loss was the fact that she lost 7 years of their upbringing. It was just, she looks back at that time as if it was just 7 years lost of her life. There was.
Yes, but any inspiration when, for example, the radio voice is the only voice they can hear for several days or weeks.
Yeah.
Wasn't difficult. Am I right? Or sometimes they have such situations.
If they were kept alone for long periods of time.
Yes.
In some cases, yeah.
Oh.
My most religious informant was a general in the Colombian army, General Mendiosa, and he was held captive for 11 years, which is one of the longest periods of time. And he, judging from his account, he seemed to have spent very long periods of time alone. And I always remember going to his house. It was very difficult to organize an interview with him because he was living in a compound, but there was sort of 3 sets of security to go and visit him, you know. And I went into, he lived in quite a small flat, but it was very nice. And he had a beautiful, huge Bible open, like on a lectern as I entered the house, and there were many references to God in our conversation. And I thought, well, after 11 years of captivity in the rainforest, that's hardly surprising.
Thank you.
Masha, do we have any questions?
For now, not, but Valentina Burkova thanks you for your very interesting report.
Thank you.
Then maybe I can ask a couple of questions. Well, the first one is actually in continuation of what you just said about the channel or now raising the Bible. So initially I wanted to ask in a broader sense. So did your respondents become more religious than they after they released than they were before kidnapping, in terms of such things as church going, well, performing religious rites and so on and so forth? What is not just believing in God as such, as an idea, but in terms of manifesting it, what is actually fundamental to happiness?
I think the answer to that is yes, and perhaps unsurprisingly so. Certainly for the, it's sort of interesting because the high-profile captives who were largely either very senior people in the army or politicians, I don't know if there's any sort of connection here, but they seem to be the more religious ones, but more religious than many of the, say, the policemen that I interviewed. And subsequent to their release, I think in the cases of all of them, their faith and their religious practice and their church attendance has only increased. And yeah, I mean, out of those, the accounts that I mentioned in the paper this evening, as I say, they were all Catholic. They were all regular attenders at church services, and yeah, they thank God for their release, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And one more question, or actually a set of questions regarding your work, your methods and like that. So, first of all, how did you pick up those people? How did you find them? How did you approach them? By email, by phone, through personal? Did you try to approach them through personal connections? Right. Or directly? And then were there any potential respondents who refused from being interviewed?
Yeah.
Did not want to be interviewed? Were there many such people? And were interviews structured or non-structured?
Yeah. So firstly, let me say, we spoke about this previously in a different context. I don't normally do quite this kind of field work. I don't normally go and interview people. I normally do more sort of long-term participant observation. And this wasn't participant observation. I mean, obviously I was, sometimes they asked me if I was a journalist, you know, when I first turned up. And often people ask me, well, how did you get interested in Colombia? Because previously all my field work had been in Scandinavia. I mean, I spent a year in Greenland, and I've done long-term field work in the Faroe Islands, and I've worked with reindeer herders in Sweden and lived in Norway. And where does Colombia come from? And The answer is the radio, and let me explain how that came about. I was working at University of Oxford, and Oxford has a famous debating society called the Union, and lots of famous people come and speak at the Union. And I used to be a member of the Union, and one evening I went along, and the speaker was Ingrid Betancourt, who was a Colombian presidential candidate. And I thought she would be talking about, I don't know, Colombian politics, but actually she spent most of the time talking about radio and this radio program. And I thought this was very interesting because I had just returned from the Faroe Islands, which is, I don't know if you know, it's a small group of islands in the mid-Atlantic between Iceland and Scotland. And I just run a project on radio, but that was a very different project. It was about radio and language revitalization and language attitudes and this kind of thing. And also the ideology, the role of ideology in sort of language standardization and radio programs and this kind of thing. I just returned from the Faroe Islands, having done this project on radio, and there she was talking about the radio. So afterwards, I asked if I could talk to her and meet her, and it turned out that we had a friend in common. I mean, it was a pure coincidence. And this was shortly after she'd been released, and I won't go into the details of her release, but there's actually a YouTube video. It was filmed. It's a very interesting story. But anyway, she was talking about this radio program, Voces de Secuestrador, and then I thought, this is interesting. I need to talk to her more about this, and that's how the project started. And then I applied for funding. I got funding from the British Academy, and Ingrid put me in touch with all kinds of people. So the first person she put me in touch with was General Luis Mendieta, who was the former head of the Colombian army, who was taken hostage. And I met him. But there is a but here. It's interesting with field work because you would think, okay, Ingrid Betancourt, former presidential candidate, this is going to open all kinds of doors for me. It wasn't really the case. And this is often the case in field work. It was the same for me when I went to Greenland. I went and lived in this unbelievably remote place for a year. I managed, first of all, I got in touch with the professor of Eskimo Aleut languages in Copenhagen, who happens to be an Englishman called Michael Fortescue. He put me in touch with a Greenlander who had a cousin who lived in this settlement, and this woman was a priest, and it all seemed perfect. And when I turned up and I said, oh, you know, I had certain phrases written in their language, or I know Johanna and Johanna, blah, blah, blah. And I found all kinds of doors closed for me because Johanna was sort of persona non grata in this community. Okay, she was a priest, but a very corrupt priest, and I lived in her house for a year and she charged me rent, and then I discovered that she didn't even own the house, and this kind of thing. And if you're living in a very remote community, that can cause all kinds of problems. So I had to sort of completely start again. And I wouldn't say it's the same in Colombia, but Ingrid Betancourt is actually not that popular in Colombia. She won't mind me saying this, I don't think. But the reason for that is because she comes from, well, first of all, although she has Colombian citizenship, she has dual citizenship, she's also a French citizen. And she spent more time in France than Colombia. She comes from a very privileged background. She's a daughter of diplomats, and she's not very representative, it has to be said, of Colombia per se. And there's a sort of a backlash against that. And so, yes, it was helpful for me to meet people like Luis Mendieta, but it wasn't very helpful for me to meet various sort of policemen and what have you. So the person who was really helpful to me was Hedvin Hoyos, who was the journalist who ran this radio program for 28 years. And he knew absolutely everything about this conflict. He knew the hostages back to front. And he put me in touch with all kinds of people. But the people that he put me in touch with were very different from the kind of people that Ingrid Betancourt put me in touch with. So you have to be really careful when you do field work, because you have that first contact, you think that's great, that's my way into the community, but it's not always a good egg, or it's not always a helpful source. it's always a sort of a risk. But Luis Mendieta, the former head of the Colombian army, is very popular in Colombia and is quite well known. And he put me in touch with various congressmen, politicians, and other people, and so it sort of went from there. Some people said no, so some people didn't want to meet me. There was one very high-profile former hostage who just this was such a painful experience for him. He didn't want to revisit it and didn't want to talk about it again, and which was totally understandable. One or two people didn't want to meet me because they felt it was too risky. And I think they felt as if, I mean, the situation has changed in Colombia now, because following this peace process, the FARC have laid down their weapons, you know, and they basically, you've got a terrorist group and you would let them free into the population, if you like. And there's a lot of people who want justice, and there's been a lot of killings, and there's a lot of people who want to find out what happened to their relatives and this kind of thing. And they initially they thought I was a journalist, and I explained I wasn't. I was an anthropologist, yeah, and so that was fine. I didn't push it. But I found out recently, as I said, that Hedda bin Hoyos has died of COVID, and in a way that creates a sort of an interesting, I mean, it's very tragic because he was very young, but it also creates a real difficulty for Colombia, I think, because he knew so much about this conflict. He had so much intelligence about what had happened to these poor people, and I don't think he shared that information with many people, so I don't know quite how that moves forward.
And just the last question, let me repeat it. Well, did you have a list of questions you wanted to ask before you started doing interviews, or were those just talks?
Yeah, no, I had a list of questions, but I soon abandoned those questions, and I didn't really want. Ideally, I didn't want the questions to be very sort of structured, because if it's like that, they assume that they're talking to a journalist. I definitely didn't want to be perceived as a journalist. So I wanted sort of to get to know them more and more, have a sort of an informal conversation, as opposed to what did you think of this? How was this? How was that? In my first interview with General Luis Mendieta, that was quite structured. But some of the informants I met on a regular basis and got to know them a bit, and one of them, who was a lawyer who had been taken hostage, he invited me to his sort of like his country home, like his dacha kind of thing, and I got to know his family, and he was very, very kind. And that was great. And it was, to be honest, it was those kind of experiences that led to this conversation about hearing the voice of God. Because, you know, obviously I did have a question here. Did you hear the voice of God? Because why would I ask that? And so that's the advantage really of sort of unstructured interviews and conversations. Is that unexpected things can emerge, and those, in my experience, it's those unexpected things which are normally more interesting, as opposed to if you have a structured, formulaic sort of set of questions, then you tend to get a formulaic set of answers. As a tangent to that, I'll just briefly mention my fieldwork in Greenland, where it was completely impossible to ask questions. I mean, direct questions. I mean, if you ask a direct question about, you know, what do you think about the not very far from where I lived, there was a US air base that had been kept secret for decades. You know, if I asked them about that, they would never answer a direct question. They would either just ignore you, or they would start to tell a story that was often totally unrelated. There I had to do field work in a totally different way. It was very, very difficult. And if you wanted to have a kind of, so there I had to do the participant observation because that was the only thing that worked. But if you really wanted to find out an answer to a question, the best way was to, first of all, sort of buy some drinks and some cakes and things, and then put out a map on the table and just say, have you ever been hunting here? And then that would trigger a response. Then they would often, in a very indirect way, they might start saying, well, I can remember asking one of the hunters that, and he said, well, I was born in the year 1949, and it sounded like a complete red herring, you know, but then eventually there was a link to this place.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Comments?
I wanted to ask, what about now? What happens now that? What is the situation considering nowadays?
In Colombia?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this, my first trip there was actually in 2016, and I went back in 2018 and again in 2019, I think. And the first time I was there, they agreed this peace proposal in 2016. So officially, the 52-year civil war ended in 2016. Unofficially, the violence has continued. And that's for a couple of reasons. There's one splinter group called the ELN that never signed the agreement. They're a sort of radical Marxist group that wish to overthrow the government. The hostage taking has stopped. I don't think there have been any high-profile hostage takings for a few years. The problem now is more the mobilization of the FARC. So once this terrorist group was disbanded and they laid down their weapons, these people had to be reintegrated somehow into society. And that has been quite a violent process because many Colombians perceive these people as killers, you know, and they want some kind of justice. So quite a number of the former FARC rebels have been killed. And so the situation isn't entirely peaceful by any means. And it's more complicated than that. There's also paramilitary groups on the other side. And of course, on top of this, we haven't spoken about this, but there's the whole drug trafficking problem, which is enormous in Colombia. And I'm not sure if there'll ever be a solution to that, to be honest. So the situation is, I would say, still reasonably unstable, but it's far, far better than it was certainly in the 1990s when, to give you an example, Medellin, which is a city I've visited many times, that used to be the most dangerous city in the world in the 1990s. Now, the crime in Medellin is about the same as Baltimore in America.
Well, it means that it is still high.
Yeah, it's still pretty high, yeah, but much better than it was. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, any more questions, comments? No, right? Well, thank you very much once again, Steve.
Thank you very much. Yeah.